By the summer of 1944, Germany's war in the West was no longer a question of tactics, but of reality. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th had shattered the last illusion that the Atlantic Wall could hold. Within days, German coastal defenses were breached. Within weeks, the Western Front was bleeding faster than Berlin was willing to acknowledge. And no one understood that better than Gerd von Rundstedt. Von Rundstedt was not a fanatic, nor a political general. He was a career officer shaped by an earlier era of warfare. Born in 1875, he had served in the Imperial Army, fought through the First World War, and risen through the ranks long before the Nazis came to power. His loyalty was to the army as an institution, not to ideology. By 1944, he was Germany's most senior field marshal, still in active command, responsible for the defense of Western Europe. From his headquarters, Rundstedt received daily reports from Normandy. They painted a bleak picture. German infantry divisions were pinned in place by constant Allied air attacks. Supply convoys were destroyed before reaching the front. Armor could barely move in daylight. Commanders reported that even minor troop movements invited immediate airstrikes. The battlefield had become transparent to the enemy. Yet from Berlin, the orders arriving at Rundstedt's desk bore little resemblance to what his officers described. Hitler demanded counterattacks that no longer existed on paper, let alone in reality. He insisted that positions be held at all costs, even when holding them meant annihilation. Withdrawal was forbidden. Flexibility was treason. Operational freedom had vanished. Rundstedt had warned about this long before the first Allied troops set foot on French soil. He had argued that Germany could not defeat the combined industrial power of the United States and Britain in a prolonged war. He had cautioned that air superiority would decide the Western Front. He had urged realistic defensive planning rather than symbolic fortifications. Most of these warnings were ignored. After D-Day, they were no longer warnings. They were conclusions. By late June, it was clear to Rundstedt that the German position in Normandy could not be stabilized. The Allies were not just landing men and equipment. They were landing them faster than Germany could destroy them. Every day strengthened the Allied foothold. Every failed German counterattack drained irreplaceable reserves. The Western Front was not merely under pressure, it was breaking. Still, Berlin demanded reassurance. High Command wanted solutions, not assessments. They wanted to hear that the situation could be recovered, that a decisive blow would soon restore control. Rundstedt understood what was being asked of him. He was expected to provide hope. Instead, he prepared to deliver truth. On July 1st, 1944, less than 4 weeks after D-Day, Rundstedt was contacted by senior figures in the German High Command. The conversation was blunt. They asked him what should be done to stop the Allied advance. His response was immediate and unfiltered. "Make peace, you fools." The words were not emotional. They were professional. To Rundstedt, the military outcome was already decided. Germany no longer possessed the resources, mobility, or command freedom required to reverse the situation. Continuing the war in the West would not change the result. It would only multiply the dead. Those 4 words crossed an invisible line. In Nazi Germany, acknowledging defeat was more dangerous than losing battles. Within days, Rundstedt was relieved of command. Official explanations cited exhaustion. The real reason was clear to everyone involved. He had spoken a truth that the regime could not tolerate. The war would continue. Millions more would die. But the most senior German commander in the West had already reached his verdict, and he had said it out loud. From the moment Allied forces established a firm foothold in Normandy, the German command structure in the West began to fracture along a familiar fault line. Frontline reality versus ideological command. Field commanders like Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel were fighting a war defined by Allied air supremacy, overwhelming material advantage, and constant pressure across a broad front. Berlin, meanwhile, continued to issue orders as if maneuver warfare were still possible. Hitler demanded immediate counterattacks, rigid defense of every position, and absolute refusal to retreat, even when units on the ground reported that such actions would result in encirclement and destruction. The Western Front had become a battlefield where movement was punished and hesitation was fatal. Yet command decisions were increasingly detached from these conditions. Rundstedt and Rommel agreed on the fundamentals, even if their temperaments differed. Both understood that Germany could no longer fight a war of attrition in the West. Rommel, who personally inspected the front, reported that German forces could not move during daylight without suffering devastating losses from Allied fighter bombers. Roads were death traps, assembly areas were immediately targeted, armor concentrations were destroyed before they could engage. Rundstedt, receiving broader operational reports, saw the same pattern repeated across the front. The Allied buildup was accelerating, while German strength was steadily eroding. Yet every attempt to adapt, shortening the line, trading space for time, conducting tactical withdrawals, was rejected by Hitler as defeatism. Orders arrived demanding sacrifices that served no strategic purpose beyond symbolic resistance. As June turned into July, the consequences of this disconnect became impossible to ignore. German counterattacks around Normandy failed repeatedly, not because of lack of courage, but because they were launched too late, with insufficient force and under constant air attack. Divisions committed piecemeal were destroyed piecemeal. Commanders increasingly faced an impossible choice: obey orders and lose their units, or disobey and risk dismissal or worse. Many chose survival, pulling back without authorization simply to preserve what remained of their forces. Discipline did not collapse because soldiers lacked resolve. It collapsed because orders no longer reflected the battlefield. Rundstedt recognized that this pattern was irreversible. Once command credibility is lost, control soon follows. For Hitler, however, acknowledging this reality was unthinkable. The war was no longer fought purely for military victory, but for ideological survival. Negotiation meant admitting failure. Withdrawal meant weakness. To concede that the war was lost in the West would undermine the entire foundation of the regime. Rundstedt's warning therefore struck at more than strategy. It challenged the political narrative itself. His assessment implied that continued resistance served no military purpose and would only prolong destruction. That was precisely why it could not be accepted. In a system built on absolute loyalty, truth became a threat. The removal of Rundstedt did not solve the problem he had identified. It merely ensured that no one else would speak as openly again. Command passed to officers who understood what was expected of them: obedience, optimism, and silence. The gap between frontline reality and high command widened further. Within weeks, Allied forces would break out of Normandy entirely, validating every concern Rundstedt and Rommel had raised. By then, the chance to act on those warnings was gone. The Western Front was no longer slipping. It was collapsing. After von Rundstedt's removal, the atmosphere within the German officer corps changed perceptibly. His dismissal sent a clear signal. Honest assessments were no longer welcome. Officers who had privately shared his conclusions now understood the risk of speaking openly. Reports became more cautious, language more evasive. Failures were reframed as temporary setbacks. Requests for withdrawal were softened or delayed. The professional military culture that had once prized accuracy and realism was replaced by one focused on survival within the system. Commanders learned to tell Berlin what it wanted to hear, not what it needed to know. This shift did not improve Germany's position. It merely obscured its deterioration. At the same time, the military situation continued to worsen exactly as Rundstedt had predicted. Allied forces achieved a decisive breakout from Normandy in late July. German units, already weakened, were unable to establish new defensive lines. Retreats turned into routs. Entire formations were encircled and destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Communications broke down. Command authority fragmented further as officers made unilateral decisions to save remnants of their units. The Western Front ceased to exist as a coherent defensive system. What remained was a series of desperate delaying actions as Allied armies advanced across France at a pace no one in Berlin had anticipated. Against this backdrop of collapse, a separate but related drama unfolded within Germany itself. On July 20th, 1944, a group of senior officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler and seize control of the state. The conspirators were driven by different motives, but many shared a belief that the war was lost and that Germany's only chance lay in ending it quickly. The plot failed. Hitler survived. The consequences were immediate and brutal. The regime responded with mass arrests, executions, and an atmosphere of paranoia that penetrated every level of the armed forces. The failed assassination attempt marked the end of any remaining possibility for independent military judgment. Loyalty to Hitler became the sole criterion for command. Professional competence, experience, and realism were secondary. Officers who had previously voiced concerns now retreated into silence. Even private conversations were dangerous. The space for dissent, already narrow, vanished entirely. Rundstedt's earlier warning now appeared prophetic in another sense. Not only was the war lost, but Germany had lost the ability to recognize that fact. Ironically, the regime would later recall von Rundstedt to command, not because his assessment had been wrong, but because there were no credible alternatives left. By then, however, the strategic situation had moved beyond recovery. Allied forces crossed the Rhine. German cities fell in rapid succession. The outcome Rundstedt had identified weeks after D-Day unfolded with grim inevitability. His words had not been defeatist. They had been precise. What distinguished Rundstedt's warning from later acknowledgments of defeat was its timing. He spoke when choices still existed, however limited. He spoke before the destruction of entire armies, before the devastation of German cities reached its peak, before millions more lives were lost. The tragedy was not that he was wrong. The tragedy was that he was right too early, in a system that could not tolerate early truth. Rundstedt himself survived the conflict. He was captured by Allied forces and later released due to age and ill health. In post-war interrogations, he did not attempt to absolve himself of responsibility for serving the regime, but he was consistent in one point. By the summer of 1944, Germany had no realistic military options left. The defeat was not sudden. It was the result of strategic overreach, industrial imbalance, and a leadership that rejected professional judgment in favor of ideological certainty. Rundstedt's blunt advice to make peace was not an act of courage or rebellion. It was the conclusion of a soldier trained to evaluate war in terms of capability, logistics, and probability. From that perspective, the verdict was unavoidable. The historical significance of Rundstedt's warning lies not in its phrasing, but in its timing. He spoke when the war could no longer be won, but before it had to end in total ruin. At that moment, a negotiated settlement might still have been conceivable, at least in theory. Such an outcome would not have spared Germany defeat, but it could have limited destruction and loss of life. That possibility disappeared as the regime doubled down on denial. By silencing honest assessments, the leadership ensured that decisions would be made in a vacuum, detached from reality. The result was a war fought to the bitter end for no strategic gain. Rundstedt's dismissal marked a broader transformation within the German command structure. After July 1944, professional military judgment ceased to matter. Loyalty replaced competence. Optimism replaced accuracy. Officers learned that survival depended on saying less, not more. This environment did not produce better outcomes. It produced paralysis, confusion, and waste. The final campaigns of the war were characterized by desperate, localized resistance rather than coherent strategy. Germany did not fight on because it could still win. It fought on because its leadership could no longer admit that it had already lost. Today, Rundstedt's 4 words stand as one of the clearest acknowledgments of defeat ever voiced by a senior German commander during the war. They were not dramatic. They were not emotional. They were simply honest. In a system built on absolute obedience and ideological certainty, that honesty became unacceptable. History would confirm what Berlin refused to hear: that the war in Europe was decided not in 1945, but in the summer of 1944, when reality was ignored and truth was dismissed as treason. Rundstedt did not change the course of the war, but he recognized its end before almost anyone else in power was willing to do so. That is why his warning still matters. Not because it was shocking, but because it was correct.